conversation, we'll discuss difficulties in writing about durational practices, the evolution of new evaluative criteria, and the weight given to ethical and aesthetic aspects of socially engaged artwork. The conversation will highlight a range of approaches and methodologies that will draw attention to new modes of critical engagement that rethink the objective, disinterested stance of the traditional art critic. So we'll begin with Noni, and she'll set up some critical frameworks about writing on socially engaged art criticism. And next, Paloma will discuss issues of how to frame a placemaking project within socially engaged art, such as the project currently in process in Antelope Valley, California. Next, we'll hear from Paige, and she holds a PhD from Brown University and an MFA in Film, Video, and New Media from the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. From 1999 to 2010, she was an active participant in 16 Beaver in New York, a platform for the discussion of the intersection of art and politics. Her writings have been published in various journals that are not limited to these, but include October, Rethinking Marxism, Reviews in Cultural Theory, and the Journal for Aesthetics and Protest. She's at work on a book-length manuscript entitled Interview Work, The Genealogy of a Medium Form. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Media Study at the University at Buffalo, SUNY. And then after Paige, we'll hear from James McAnally. James is an artist, curator, and critic whose work seeks to create a space of expanded authorship and exchange. He's the co-founder and executive editor of Contemporary Art Review, an international platform for contemporary art criticism that focuses on artist-run and alternative spaces. James is also founder and co-director and curator of the Luminary, an incubator for new ideas and art space in St. Louis, Missouri. In his artistic practice, he works as part of the collaborative U.S. English. He is a founding member of the Common Field Network of Independent Arts Projects and Spaces, and has served as the visual arts panelist in the National Endowment of the Arts. After we hear from Paige and James, Noni and Paloma will respond with a few questions, and soon after that, Stephanie will explain a little bit more about field, and then we'll open it up for discussion. And Stephanie will be our timekeeper to make sure we all have time at the end to hear from her.
Thanks so much for coming today. So I'm going to be speaking about a few critical models for writing about socially engaged art, and how this topic has been approached both historically and in contemporary discourse. I think that the issue of critical frameworks is worth looking at in part because the genre of socially engaged art has been named, defined, and institutionalized fairly recently. And it's true that there is a long history behind it, and it would be possible to look at its genealogy and go back many decades to trace the roots and influences of this kind of work. But I also think that it brings up challenges for art criticism that weren't necessarily present or were less visible in past forms of art practice. On the pragmatic level, basic challenges of writing about this kind of work include its durational nature, since so many projects occur over periods of months or years. Another challenge is how to write about projects that involve large numbers of people, and people coming from very different backgrounds and with different levels of investment in the project. And then also the immateriality of the work can present a challenge for art critics, since so much of this work revolves around conversation and social interaction. Aside from practical concerns, there are also more theoretical questions that revolve around the aesthetic nature of this type of work and the traditions that come out of the historical avant-garde that affect the way this art is made, viewed, and written about. So I'm interested in looking at both practical and theoretical challenges, and in asking questions about what role critics should play in writing about socially engaged art, and probably leaving most of these questions unanswered, but hopefully starting a conversation that we can continue. And what I hope this conversation brings up is the potential for writing about socially engaged art to be more than a hermeneutics of form or a rehearsal of critical theory. So while drawing from these traditions, it might also involve forms of writing that come out of subjective accounts, political engagement in specific issues, and a rethinking of critical theory, in which theory comes out of practices of local and everyday culture, rather than being applied to art in a more abstract manner. So I'll start by going through a few issues related to art criticism that I think are particularly relevant when it comes to looking at and thinking about socially engaged art. And then I'll move into a discussion based on some of my own experiences as a writer. So one source that I find really useful is Suzanne Lacey's book, Mapping the Terrain, which was published in 1995. And the book is about new genre public art, which she defines as art that communicates and interacts with a broad and diversified audience about issues directly relevant to people's lives. In the final chapter, she discusses criticism of this type of work, and she highlights 4 aspects that make it different and call for a reconsideration of critical models. These are interaction, audience, intention, and effectiveness. And the circle diagram here is from her book, and it suggests a way to kind of visualize audience interaction and investment in a particular art project. And I like the idea that someone could start on kind of like the outer rings of this circle here and then move into the inner circle as they put in time and effort and become more attached and committed to a project. In terms of interaction, Lacey points out that community-based artworks involve a different relationship between artist and audience. This often involves artists learning new skills, including how to collaborate, how to cross over with other disciplines, or how to translate art concepts that might be viewed as exclusive or opaque into more accessible language. How the work relates to its audience is a central concern of socially engaged art, and many artists and critics have envisioned and theorized this type of art as less about a material product or a representation, and more about the space of communication between the artist and audience. So it follows from this that critics writing about this type of work would likely be much more involved in listening to conversations, attending workshops, talking to people, and interviewing participants to get a sense of their experience working on these projects. The issue of the artist's intentions often comes up in relation to socially engaged art criticism, particularly around art practices that claim to be doing good in a particular community. Many critics of socially engaged art have pointed out that this type of art is impossible to evaluate since it requires judging an artist's intentions, which may be good even if the final project doesn't work out. And effectiveness is another issue within criticism that can't be ignored, even though it brings up sort of uncomfortable questions regarding the quantitative results of these types of projects. Many socially engaged art projects operate in a quasi-sociological manner, which seems to call for an analysis of concrete results. But at the same time, most projects also operate through different levels of meaning, and they're attempting to produce both illustrative and metaphorical meanings, as well as concrete change. So I think that an important stumbling block for socially engaged art criticism to step over is the idea that these are separate things. Instead of seeing metaphor and concrete action as intimately connected and always in dialogue. So these are just a few aspects of socially engaged art that are more or less unique and call for new models of criticism. Suzanne Lacey proposes that critics employ a partisan approach in discussing this type of work, and I really like this idea. This would acknowledge the interests of the critic, possibly a shared commitment to the project or the issue they're writing about. And I think this is definitely at odds with the kind of traditional, disinterested, detached approach to criticism that comes out of modernist aesthetics. This idea of the partisan critic is an interesting one that I think could be built on in a few different ways. So first of all, it seems to me like there's been a lot of interest lately in drawing from anthropology and learning from current discussions around ethnographic methodology. And I think this makes sense because of the duration of these types of projects. They're often site-specific manner, and their collaborative or community-based nature. So turning to ethnography can offer practical solutions in terms of how to be there and observe what's going on, and how to document this experience. But, of course, there are certain pitfalls as well. Art historian Hal Foster addressed these issues in his essay, The Artist is Ethnographer, and his arguments bring insight to the role of the critic as well, I think. So he makes the argument that when contemporary artists work with communities or groups that are not their own, they risk playing the role of the colonizer. And so his position is that community-based art often, or occasionally, reverts into forms of contemporary primitivism. And this argument is extremely important for anyone making or writing about community-based art to consider. But I also think that it's problematic to just completely dismiss ethnographic methods and to simply equate ethnography with primitivism. And recently there have been some critics who have discussed ethnographic modes of practice that contrast with the traditional model that's employed by Foster. So Anthony Downey has written about the return of the ethnographer in relation to contemporary collaborative art. And he calls for an ethics of engagement, which involves moving past the tactics of revelation and exposure associated with the historical avant-garde. He draws from the writing of Mikhail Bakhtin, and he argues for a reinscription of aesthetics as a form of socio-political practice. Anthropologist George Marcus has also written about new models of ethnography in relation to art, and his interest is in looking at the role of the artist through the construction of a self-reflexive autoethnography. He also believes that any critical anthropology worthy of the name not only tries to speak truth to power, but also tries to understand power and its agencies in the same ethnographically committed terms, and in the same boundaries of fieldwork in which the subaltern is included. So I really like this quote, and I think it's a great point and could be usefully applied to writing about socially engaged art as well. Aside from issues of duration and community, another issue that comes up for me as a critic is what my role should be or is right now in relation to the public. So I think that looking back at historical models of the public intellectual can maybe bring some light to this question, which is really, once you spend all of this time learning and thinking about a particular project and becoming familiar with all of the discourses in which it is embedded, what do you do with this knowledge? Where does it go and how does it circulate? These questions have been considered by many different authors and from different perspectives. In the 1930s, Antonia Graham came up with the idea of the organic intellectual, which he described as an individual who naturally emerged out of a particular class and became a leader of political movements within that class. This was a revolutionary idea because it contrasted with the orthodox Marxist-Leninist belief that revolution should be consciously shaped and guided from above. Several decades later, Foucault wrote about the specific intellectual, which he contrasted with the universal intellectual who is associated with master narratives. And he argued that theory is an activity conducted alongside those who struggle for power, and not their illumination. So the role of the specific intellectual is not to reveal hidden truths or to speak for others, but to work alongside them in localized struggles. And then a third model is what Julia Kristeva described as the dissident intellectual, who works more actively against dominant social formations. Kristeva writes that the ruthless and irreverent dismantling of the workings of discourse, thought, and existence is therefore the work of a dissident. Such dissidence requires ceaseless analysis, vigilance, and will to subversion, and therefore necessarily enters into complicity with other dissident practices in the modern Western world. And I really like this idea of being able to connect different types of dissidents together through shared political beliefs. So now I'd like to talk really briefly about my own experience writing about socially engaged art and how it has touched on some of these issues. So the Crossing Communities Art Project was established in Winnipeg, Canada, in the late 1990s by the artist Edith Bruguiere. And it was consciously modeled along the lines of a new genre of public art project, similar to what Suzanne Lacey wrote about in that book. So it began as a prison art exchange project and grew into a collaborative art project in downtown Winnipeg. And it functioned through mentorships between established women artists and women who were in conflict with the law, or who had issues with drug use, prostitution, or mental health issues. The project lasted for 10 years, and it resulted in a wide range of collaborative productions, including performances, videos, and interventions in public spaces. The aim of the project was to raise questions and engage in actions around issues the women were concerned with, many of which stemmed from histories of colonialism and racism in Winnipeg. So just a few examples of what they made, because the project lasted for 10 years, and so they made like hundreds of works, but these are just a few images here. So the top left is from a video called Butterfly, which was a video commemorating missing and murdered Indigenous women, and it was screened at a public forum in Winnipeg that was focused on this issue. Then on the right is from a video called Women and Girls in the Sex Trade, which involved women talking about their experiences working as prostitutes in the city. And then the bottom image is from a postcard project where participants intervened in various public spaces in downtown Winnipeg. So in terms of writing about this kind of work, I think that what it can do is, first of all, bring awareness to your project and extend the circle of people who know about it and care about it. And that's where I think that interdisciplinary journals and websites for art writing can be really important. Since Crossing Communities was an art project, but could also be interesting to think about in relation to politics, sociology, urban studies, feminist theory. And then in terms of some of the issues that Suzanne Lacey discussed, the partisan approach, I think, was one that I tried to follow when I was writing about this project, and to acknowledge from the beginning. So this meant putting myself in my writing and talking about my experiences with the politics of place in Winnipeg, and how space has been produced historically in the city. In terms of effectiveness, I wasn't interested in a sociological approach that would look at recidivism or change in employment status or some other means of measurement focused on rehabilitation. Instead, what I focused on were the qualitative meanings that participants drew from the experience. So for some participants, this actually involved eventually disowning the project and becoming artists or activists in their own right. My experience involved writing about the project after it had already ended. So looking back on this now, it seems problematic in certain ways because I was relying mostly on material artifacts as well as interviews with participants. So it was difficult because there were a lot of competing narratives, differing opinions regarding authorship and value, and a lot of interpersonal conflict. So my approach was to try to respect the many different perspectives on this project, and incorporate different and conflicting voices into my writing. So it seems like social practice, socially engaged art, community-based art, however you define it or label it, is going to keep growing as a genre, and as various practices and projects emerge, there will continue to be more questions about how to write about this type of work. The partisan approach is one that I find really appealing, and I think that looking to other disciplines that deal with relationships between communities, artists, and researchers can be helpful too. And then finally, I think that focusing on the relationship between theory and practice is incredibly important. And one way to focus on this is for critics to think not just about a final product, but also about the inner workings of these practices and the specific interactions and relationships that develop through time.